Hi class, this is the video to cover inference to the best explanation. So as presented, there's another inductive argument form. There's kind of a weird deductive version of this, so if you're Googling for extra information, careful of that. In the inference to best explanation, as presented in both textbooks, so as we're going to use in this course, the general idea is it starts off with some observation, something we know, and then works backwards to its source or cause. Let me pause here. As such, the this is sometimes gets subsumed under what textbooks call causal inference. We'll talk about causal inference later, but causal inference as traditionally presented can go cause to effect or effect to cause. But wait a minute, notice inference to the best explanation just went effect to cause. This is fine. This is a terminology dispute. So I just want to be very clear here because it's going to come up a few times in this unit. If on the exam you called this a causal inference, I wouldn't mark off. What's important is you understand what the actual inference is and what makes it a good or bad one by identifying any of the correct or acceptable terminologies for that you've done it. So just whenever you see those, we've also given several names for fallacies a few times. I'm not going to mark something wrong that's right. So don't let the fact that it's sometimes called something different worry you. But do definitely be aware this is the inductive version that deals with cause and effect. So we see these all the time. And Robinson kind of very helpfully gives kind of our usual version of this where it's the base observation. Well, Mickey's head is shaved, something we observed. Let's infer a cause for that. Well, he's too young to want to admit he's bald. So those are the kind of things we hear all the time. And notice it's one premise to one conclusion. Now, one thing you will notice is there's pretty much no such thing as a good one premise inductive argument. There's always implied premises. And so when you're talking about the base version, you end up having an implied premise here that is something that if we're actually going to do it, we're going to have if that is do it in a way that's strong, we have to have what I called in the review sheet the robust version. That's where you add a premise like, well, Mickey is bald. The most likely explanation is that he doesn't want to admit he's bald, so he shaved his head. Therefore, that's what happened. And so the robust version sounds a little redundant because the second premise we add is something like the most likely explanation for premise one is what I'm gonna say is the conclusion. Therefore, the conclusion. So the kind of odd version, the base version, is just explanation. Sorry, that's wrong. The most basic version, what I call the base case, is observation, therefore explanation. But the robust version is explanation. Sorry, try that again. The robust version is observation. Premise one is observation. Premise two, assertion that the best explanation for that observation is the one you're going to conclude. Conclusion, the explanation. Now notice that you're saying everything twice, and that's very often why people leave it off. It's not that they're trying to do something skeezy or illicit. They're not trying to hide premises. They're just, you don't want to say everything twice. It's almost like imagine a world in which every time you made an assertion, you started with, it's true that. So instead of just saying my water cup is blue, I'll say, it's true that my water cup is blue. Well, it's implied that if you're saying it because you think it's true. Similarly, it's implied that if you're giving it as an explanation, you think it's the best explanation. So why are we articulating it then? Because that's what we're actually evaluating. When we're evaluating inference to the best explanation, what we want to know is it the best explanation? And so Robinson goes through these very nice kind of patterns of what we need to do to evaluate. And there's really a couple of things we need to look for. And as we saw in the analogies one, where these go wrong is where fallacies come up. But fallacies are just an effect of when these go bad. They're not this new separate thing. So what do we look for? The plausibility of an explanation. So would Mickey not wanting to admit he's bald be an explanation for his shaving his head? Yeah. And that's not just definitional because we're dealing with induction. So remember our rule of total defense. Well, we know people in the world who do this. It happens all the time. When people start to go bald early, yeah, they shave their heads quite often. And so the first thing we look for is it a plausible explanation? Notice if it's not a plausible explanation, it's not a good inference. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about it after I finish going through the argument. But when that fails, when it's not a plausible explanation, the usual fallacy associated with that is what's called non causa pro causa. So there's kind of a little family of fallacies called false cause, where causal inferences go bad. Non causa pro causa is just fancy Latin for not the cause for the cause. So if you have some implausible explanation, it's probably not the cause and you've committed non causa pro causa fallacy. But anyway, if it is a plausible explanation, well, then you go on to the next one, because here's something to remember. A strong argument is one that the premises render the conclusion likely, which means we not only have to have a plausible explanation, we have to have an explanation that is likely. And so what other ways might that happen? Check for alternatives. So if there's another alternative that is plausible, I'm having trouble thinking of one here. Maybe I shouldn't use this example, but Mickey does have a really nice shaped head. I've been told that many times. And maybe I just wanted to show it off. Well, that's an explanation. Let's pretend that's plausible. Well, if you have two plausible explanations, then it's fallacious to infer that the one is correct. If there's just two alternatives and either of those alternatives is equally good, we're going to be blocked from inferring one until we know which is better than the other. And again, numericize it. Remember, inductive arguments admit to degrees. So if you think of it percentages, well, if two alternatives are the only alternatives there are and they're equally good, that means they're both 50% likely. And so we can't infer that one is better than the other. In fact, and just here's one of the fallacies for the list on the review sheet. There's a fallacy where if the premises establish that both options are equally good, then inferring either is in fact fallacious. That's called an appeal to ignorance. The premises say we don't know, and the conclusion says we know. But there's also more to it than that, because there's also can be a lot of explanations. So there could be two really good ones, say 40%, 40%, and then a bunch of 1% explanations. Well, Mickey just went as Mr. Clean for Halloween. So as a result, just because there's even two explanations doesn't get you to strong, but very often that's not the case. And so another thing that could happen is there might be one best explanation that's still not a good explanation. So again, to give a numeric example, there might be one example that's 40% likely, fudging things so the numbers work, and then 6 explanations that are 10% likely. Well, you should believe the 40% over any of its alternatives, but that's not the same as saying you should believe the 40%. And that's the distinction Robinson makes between strong and least surprising. Remember, strong has to be likely, it has to be more than 50%. Least surprising just means the highest number that's less than 50%, or 50% or less, I guess I should say. So these are all things that go on with inference to the best explanation. And you're doing something fallacious if you leave options off that are good. You're doing something fallacious that if you present exactly two options when there's more. And you're doing something fallacious if you have an implausible explanation. So let me say a little more about each of these. I was a little annoyed last week because I was doing one of these videos and I just had to scrap the whole thing because somebody came pounding on my door. Or should really have used a headset, I guess, or something. Well, anyway, so I shut down the video. I went to the door, and it was somebody from a local religious group who was trying to argue about the Earth seeming to be fine-tuned in certain ways to support life. Therefore, the Bible is true. And what's the problem there? It ignores alternatives, right? Well, let's say it is 100% established that fine-tuning implies some sort of deity. That fine-tuning is only explains supernatural. Let's just stipulate that. Now, if you're interested in those questions, go take the philosophy of religion course. You can talk about that stuff all day. But let's stipulate fine-tuning does imply a deity. Well, once you get there, you still have lots of possibilities. Well, why think Christianity is true rather than Islam or Hinduism or the religious presentation by the Lakota Sioux, or so there any world religion you know of that has a creator deity, or none of them, right? There's also the possibility that there's a creator deity and all of the religions are wrong. And so by presenting an explanation that ignores the alternatives, that is a fallacious argument. So let's put a little bit of terminology here. So again, appeal to ignorance is one that says, well, the premises say nothing's been proven, often because it's 50-50, but the conclusion takes a stand anyway. That's appeal to ignorance, be aware of it. But there's another one that I mentioned last week is called false dilemma. A false dilemma is one of those weird patterns of errors of reasoning that's not a problem of inference so much as a false premise. False dilemma says there's exactly two options and you eliminate one, therefore the first option, but those aren't the only two. So we could recast that argument given by the solicitors at my front door if they said something like, well, the fine-tuning of the universe is either explained by chance, that is, or natural forces, that is, or Christianity. Well, natural forces are implausible for these reasons they give me, therefore Christianity. Well, that's a valid argument, and it's in a sense an inference to the best explanation because they're trying to assert that the first explanation by chance is not a good one. And so it can fit the form of inference to best explanation, but by leaving off all the alternatives, they have in fact created a bad argument, a fallacious argument. And so that's an example of what's called a false dilemma or false dichotomy, depending on your textbook, where two options are presented as if they are the only options when there's clearly others. So other examples of false dilemma, well, either vote for Republicans or vote for communism, or on the other side of things, well, vote Democrat or vote fascist. Well, no, those are obviously not the only two options. We like to reduce politics to oversimplifications of these things, but it's fallacious. And those, notice those are rhetorical. Uh, they're trying to convince you with bad reasoning. So, but the other way that inferences to the best explanation go wrong is if the explanation is just not a very good explanation. And that's when it's the type of false cause called non causa pro causa. So uh, these happen quite often uh, in a lot of different ways. It's a very general fallacy that just happens when the proffered explanation is just really not a very good one. And so, by very not very good, I just mean not very plausible. And so, let me give an example from recent news. Well, there's obviously lots of evidence of climate emergency and catastrophic climate change. And I heard somebody say that, well, people were just putting that data forward for the money. Now, that's implausible for a few reasons. One, those gold digging Nobel laureates is very rarely a phrase that you can actually use. But second of all, money is almost always in the minority view. Like you never make a lot of money stating what everybody believes, stating what is commonly believed, stating what is manifestly the case. There is no money in that. Instead, the money is the opposite, right? The money goes in the minority view, and so uh, it's a doubly implausible explanation that all these people, all these scientists are saying these things, putting their careers on the line is yet another reason it's implausible, just to articulate a false agenda that somehow they're trying to do these things for some reason other than truth. So that would be just an example from. I just annoy myself by reading the news. I don't know why I bother, but but by uh, an implausible explanations for the phenomenon. So a more plausible one is they believe it is true, which is explained by it being true. I hope you're noticing as I'm using this type of example, inference to the best explanation when cast this way is really, really common. When you're trying to explain something, anything, uh, you are generally using something that can fit into this pattern type. So just a couple more examples from real life. Well, look at my background behind me. You might say, oh look, this row right here, if you have good resolution, and this row right here, if you have good resolution, are all David Hume books, stuff that he wrote and books about what he wrote. That's an observation. Well, you can probably explain why those books are there. There's a good explanation. Well, because uh, Mickey is interested in the philosophy of David Hume. Uh, but or you could give not so good explanations of it, and there's not really a more plausible explanation. Well, they're props, or maybe that's his spouse's office, and these things and the other. And so there's other explanations out there, but you're very unlikely to assert them. And but notice that if I am actually turning that one premise, one conclusion argument into something that is able to be defended robustly by implicitly saying the best explanation for that, just the way people are, they don't have multiple bookshelves in their offices dedicated to a single author unless there's some interest there. It becomes a very common source of reasoning. And I'm using simple cases as well as complex ones just so you realize that, like analogy, inferences to best explanation are omnipresent. They're so common. So think of some arguments you might infer. Well, there's a picture of this lovely lady here in my background. You could probably make some inferences about what that means too. And just very common. These are not hard inferences, or why there's light on one side of my face when I'm doing this. You could probably make a good inference about why they are. And if someone forces you to write it out in the inference to best explanation pattern, you're really putting your money where your mouth is. You're putting your reasons out there to be evaluated. And in basic cases like that, you'll just realize, yep, those are good reasons. But in some of the more complex inferences, perhaps ones where we're emotionally invested such as the example of the solicitors at the door. I don't think they're trying to fool anybody or sweep anything under the table. It's just the fact that they're so emotionally invested that the fact of other religions doesn't even enter into their head to realize they're skipping an all important step. So keep working with infants to the best explanation. Be aware of false dilemma or dichotomy, non causa, no cause, that non causa pro causa version of false cause, and appeal to ignorance, where the premises assert nothing can be concluded, and yet you conclude something anyway. See you next time.